Hey, what's up guys, Sir Emanon here, bringing to you a guide today actually on how to effectively side deck. Now of course I'm going to be talking about the Lunalight Orcust deck a bit later on, but I want this to be a bit of a more generic tool for you guys because I think that in order to be a more effective player overall, I think it's very important that people actually kind of understand the more broad theory in terms of how to side deck for a wide variety of matchups and for any deck, not just one specific deck. If you're so fixated on just the Lunalight Orcust strategy, then I think it might actually sort of hinder your approach to playing other decks and how other decks might actually side for you, which is a very important component of side decking. So I think generally speaking, I want this to be an overarching guide on how to side deck, and then we can later apply it to the Lunalight Orcust strategy. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and dive on in. So I think a very good introductory question to this discussion is why exactly we do side deck. Now, of course, we are given the side deck as a mechanic and as a tool as part of the rules of this game, but in terms of why we side the way we do, I think it's important to actually remind ourselves what the core foundational reasons are for it. So I think that we can actually extrapolate this in three different ways. The first of which is a way to facilitate our strategy. And by this I mean ways that we can aid our deck to perform as best as it can, especially in games 2 and 3. So let's say for example that your deck might have a hard time against back row or floodgates. Then in this case, you can aid your strategy by, say, siding in back row removal cards like Twin Twister, Cosmic Cyclone, Hatronade, stuff like that. A very good actual example of this would be the first place deck list from YCS Niagara Falls, piloted by David Mendoza. He actually side decked 3 copies of Danger Zone, which is not a card that you would consider to be like maybe a generic hate card or an all-around purpose card for a specific matchup, but this card is one that actually allowed him to basically proceed better with his strategy if he were to go first, since obviously his Danger Grand Maju strategy was a blind second list. This is a very good example of ways that you can actually help your strategy to be improved in later games. The second way we can think about this is a way to hinder our opponent's strategy, which I think is probably the easiest to kind of grasp. So obviously these are more offensive cards that in essence try to stop our opponent from performing their win condition. So a good example of this would be Reboot and Twin Twister, specifically against back row heavy decks that need their back row to survive. So like these cards are potentially blowout cards that can stop our opponent from actually achieving their win condition. Another good example would be perhaps like cards like Artifact Lancia and Drone Lockbird. These cards are also very specific cards that hurt certain strategies. You can think decks like Orcust, or in the case of Droll, like Spiral back in the day, or like Danger, FTK. You know, these kinds of cards are cards that you put in specifically for matchups and things that you want to be able to bring in based on what you're playing against. The final way that I view side decking is a way to cover for our weaknesses. So this sort of goes in tandem with the facilitation aspect, but this is a more defensive kind of line of thinking where you kind of ask yourself the question, okay, what does my deck lose to? Like, what can my opponent do that would automatically not allow me to play the game? So good examples of this would be, say, if my opponent was, for example, going to board an Artifact Lancia against my Orcust strategy, and I really don't have a way to actually account for this in my main board. Maybe I am maining Call by the Grave, but I want to be able to make sure that I don't actually just automatically lose to that card and get OTK the following turn. So I might side Cyframe Gear Gamma. Another instance would be Solemn Judgment in the previous cases of, say, people siding in Rid Reboot and Twin Twisters. Maybe you get totally destroyed by those cards, and you need a card like Solemn Judgment to be actually able to play the game and not get immediately blown out. So basically, determining what we need to actually utilize in our strategy, it could be a combination of any of these, or it could just be indexing more towards one. But regardless, if we can recognize which one of these or which few of these we should incorporate, it'll allow us to be very, very efficient for actually allowing us to succeed, especially based on how our deck performs in the metagame. So that is something that I will touch on a little bit later on. Alright, so here I have listed for you guys some general siding tips that you can potentially integrate into your own strategy to help further your guys' game in games 2 and 3, regardless of what deck you're playing. So the first thing that I have here is knowing the types of cards that you're siding and why you are siding them. Now this is kind of like the whole identifying why we side deck in general, but now we can apply this to the cards that we're specifically using. Are you siding a card again to specifically hurt your opponent? Are you siding a card that has wide coverage for the meta? Are you siding a card that might allow you to play the game better depending on what your opponent might side. Like, you should always account for all these different factors and more, and knowing what your cards are designed to do, not only of course in terms of, you know, how they interact with certain opponents' decks, but how you might be able to use them for more than just one specific initial purpose. I think that sort of thing can take you a long way. The second thing to think about is predetermined siding. So this is a very, very important practice that I think many of you guys should start doing if you haven't already been doing so. So essentially what you're going to be doing here is like either writing down on a piece of paper or just, you know, going on like Google Docs or something, and just writing down every matchup that you might expect to see at your next tournament, whether it be your locals, regionals, YCS, whatever. And essentially, what I like to do in particular is, you know, use a Google Doc, and you'll see this later, but I have a way to actually map out essentially for each matchup which cards I'm going to be taking in and which cards I'm going to be taking out based on if I'm going first or second. This is very useful if you know what the meta is, if it's very established, but even for you know, less established meta games, maybe even like this one where there's, you know, quite a lot of decks, you can still actually, you know, come up with a pretty decent way to be able to actually, you know, see which cards are going to be the most effective, because obviously there's many different side choices for each specific matchup, but figuring out which ones are going to be the best for you, the most efficient for you, the ones that give you the most, I guess, mileage out of your side decking slots, that's going to be what allows you to actually make better use of your very limited 15 side deck slots. Then there's sort of kind of alluding to the last point, is finding multiple purpose cards. And what I mean by this is things that you can actually utilize in a wide spread of matchups. So I would say cards like Twin Twisters. I know I keep going back to the Twin Twister, but that's a very good generic card that can be utilized against a myriad of back row decks. So, you know, that's why it's been a popular side deck staple for the past, you know, 3 years or so, because it is a card that, generally speaking, can be applied across many different decks over many different formats. And these cards can be very useful if you are kind of struggling for space and need some cards to cut. You could leave these cards in as a hedge against multiple matchups. Another thing is to not try to cover for unlikely events. And what I mean by this is that if there is something very specific that your deck loses to, and you're aware of this, and it might come up in the course of a long tournament, but is realistically speaking just not very probable to happen, the correct answer is a lot of the time just to say, I accept I'm going to lose to this if I see it, but I know I'm not going to see it very often. So an example for this, for my strategy for Niagara, is I knew Necroz is still kind of floating around here and there, but I didn't expect to see it. However, if Necroz drops a Vanity's Ruler on me, I just don't have any out to that card. Like, straight up, I can't beat that card in my main deck, and unless if I side specific cards for it, then I'm not going to be having a very good time. So initially, I was trying to, like, perhaps sort of cover for it by side decking a card like Dark Ruler no more, just, you know, to be able to have that sort of application as well. But I eventually came to the conclusion that, you know, this isn't really a great way to approach side decking. I didn't like Dark Ruler no more for a lot of the other matchups, and having it in there just for that specific Vanity's Ruler interaction was probably not the most efficient way of side decking for me. Another good example of this was the Dragon Link FTK that started popping up right before the event. So people have started to figure out that any way to get into Ebe the World Chalice Justicer is an FTK with the basically the Heretics, as well as the Super Alloy Beast Raptinus, or whatever the Gemini, whatever the fusion monster is that makes your Geminis affect monsters. You guys know the FTK I'm talking about. So that's another FTK that kind of popped up where it kind of fell under the same lines of Dragon Link, but logically speaking, I kind of figured, well, people are trending away from Dragon Link because of its vulnerability to hand traps, right? So I know that it is something that people might try and cheese and try and, you know, get some wins with. But overall, at a bigger event like a YCS Niagara, I didn't really feel it was worth it to specifically try and cover for that deck more than I had to. Like, if it was maybe the best deck, then I'd probably play a lot more hand traps than I ended up playing, for example. So these are kind of examples of what I mean by unlikely events. Like, you don't want to be able to say, hey, you know, I automatically lose to this, but I have to, you know, cover for it even if it's like maybe a 1 in 100 chance of happening, because realistically that's just not a very good way to use, again, your very limited spots. And then finally, I would say to actually just try and focus on optimization when it comes to side decking. So what I mean by this is that you might have a card that has pretty good application, right? Like you might be able to like say, hey, I can use X card in, you know, a variety of matchups. Maybe there's like only 1 or 2 instances where it actually comes up to be useful, but overall, like it still has a place. But if there are better cards for that slot, like that do the job better or even a different job entirely, but just are overall more efficient, then I would generally say it's better to sacrifice, you know, those, you know, medium impact cards for the higher impact ones, which might sound intuitive on the surface, but like when you have to cut some cards in order to put stuff in, like you might be cutting a card that you consider good, but in general, you have to put in the best cards for the matchup. So a good example of this would be, say, something like Call by the Grave. This is a card that is very, very, you know, widespread purpose. It can help stop hand traps, any graveyard effect really. Like it's, you know, good against a wide variety of cards. And something that you might want to consider is, like, say, maybe going second against Sky Striker, right? So like maybe you're trying to play through a board and your opponent really doesn't have too many hand traps. Maybe you see like they're playing Mystic Mind, for example, and are just really not playing hand traps, and you see this game 1, and you might be thinking, well, Call by the Grave can be used to stop Ray still, and that's true, and you can stop Ray and you can maybe go for the OTK afterward. But is that really more effective, leaving in Call by the Grave, than siding in something like, you know, Twin Twister to out Mystic Mind, or, you know, other generic back row cards? And again, I keep going back to Twin Twister, but like these are examples that I think that people often kind of don't really consider too much, and you have to really think what is, again, the most efficient way for me to side deck, and that's really what we're just trying to do here. So these are just the more general things that I have for you guys to take away here. Alright, and now I'm going to talk about probably the most important component of your predetermined siding process, and I'm going to place heavy emphasis on the predetermined portion of it, because you should always be doing this before you enter an event. I want to make that, again, very clear. Use a Google Doc, use the Microsoft Word document, use, you know, a sheet of paper if you have to, like any means that you can, but determining what to put in and what to board out. So you want to be solving the meta as best as you can, right? Like you want to be not only knowing what decks are going to be prevalent, but how those decks beat you and how you beat those decks. And in the case of, you know, how the decks beat you, you want to be able to kind of adjust for that as best as you can. So you want to be doing all of this before any event. So the best thing you should do is obviously figure out the way your deck works, right? So, you know, it is obviously, you know, recommended that you know how your deck operates in a game 1 scenario. Like you want to know your win conditions, you want to know exactly what your deck is designed to do and its space in the metagame. Basically what cards are integral to your strategy and what cards you can maybe take out based on if they're good or bad in the matchup. If you're maining certain cards as a part of a meta call, then that's also something to consider. So just knowing the core foundational fundamental mechanics of your strategy versus cards that you might flex based on the positioning in the metagame that you have determined for yourself. These are things that you should definitely take into account beforehand. So this is going to be an idea that I actually came up with from a Reddit thread by MST.TV's Oscar. This was actually posted on Reddit about 2 years ago, and I'll actually leave a link to it in the description box down below if you guys want to read the post in its entirety. But the post was entitled Competitive Siding Guide, and a very, very interesting idea that I found back when I read this in 2017 that I actually still do to this day is actually sorting your cards into piles. So you want to identify cards that once again are, you know, necessary for your strategy to function. These are what I deem engine cards. So these are cards that really, if you didn't have these cards, you wouldn't be playing that deck. So think like your Sky Striker Ace Rays, your Subterra Gurus, your you know, Orcust Nightmares, Harp Horrors, things like that. All these cards that your deck really would not be your deck if you didn't play them. So put those away in a pile called Pile A. Then you can go ahead and look at your consistency cards. So things like your Pot of Desires or your Terraformings, your Dualities, things like that. So these are your consistency cards. And there might be some overlap, keep this in mind. I'm very aware that, you know, it's not entirely fair to compartmentalize these cards specifically for just one way or the other. Like you might have a card like Engage that is obviously consistency, but also an engine card for Sky Striker. But generally speaking, your consistency cards don't tend to be your engine cards as well. Like you want to think about, those cards, like in the case of Sky Striker, it wouldn't be cards like Engage that are consistency cards, but cards like Rhoda, cards like Upstart, Terraforming, Foolish Goods with like Metaphors Fusion, stuff like that. So those are the cards that we're talking about for consistency. And then the final thing is the cards that are the utility cards. So what I mean by this is the cards that you would maybe side in and out, and these are the ones that are interchangeable. These are the ones that you typically want to be boarding out and in between games, depending on what your matchup is. So cards like Call by the Grave, cards like Hand Traps, things like if you're like main decking Pancratops or something, like Mind Controls, Evenly Matches, things like that. Things that serve many different functions but aren't a core part of your strategy, you would put into pile C. So what does this all mean, right? Like you basically want to make sure that you don't side out the cards from pile A, because these are the cards that you kind of need as your win condition. You're not really playing a Sky Striker deck if you're taking out your 3 Ray. Meanwhile, cards from pile B are cards that maybe you could consider siding out, but only in cases where like you can't afford to take out the cards in pile C, because you really need those cards in this specific matchup. So let's say it's a trap heavy format and like say a trap deck like Paleozoic is the best deck. So maybe you main deck like all the back row hate that you can, but in exchange for that, like maybe you side even more back row hate if your deck has a particularly bad time. Let's say that maybe you have to side out a consistency card to be able to board in even more hate just to make sure that you win the matchup. Sometimes it is okay to oversaturate in terms of the cards that are good utility for the matchup, because in some cases, the argument could be made that, okay, well, I can't play the game anyway. It doesn't matter how consistent my deck is if my opponent is, shutting me out of my deck's win condition, which is a very fair point. But generally speaking, if that's not the case for you, if you have a balanced to favorable matchup, you want your deck to still be consistent so that it can still perform what it needs to be doing each game. And of course, pile C are the cards that are the most flexible. These are the ones that you want to be able to side in and out accordingly based on how you see fit. Okay, so as a bit of a small exercise for this, just so you guys can visualize it better, I'm going to be using cards from the Subterra Guru strategy, and reason being is that it's very easy to understand these cards as far as your specific purposes are for organizing the cards the way that I have them listed. So for each of the piles, we can easily see what goes into what. So Guru and Hidden City are obviously going to be pile A, simply because they are your engine cards or your win conditions. For pile B, we're going to have obviously the cards like Pot of Extravagance and Terraforming, simply because they help you see your engine cards a lot faster, and of course utility cards too, but these are consistency boosters. And then finally for pile C, we have stuff like the Hand Traps and the Floodgates, so cards like Ash and There Can Be Only One. These are cards that you maybe could conceivably side out based on the matchup, but overall help complement your main strategy. Alright, now to the part where some of you guys I'm sure have been itching for me to get to, which is the part specifically pertaining to Lunalights. I'm actually not going to spend a great deal of time on this because I think, again, it's important to get the fundamentals of siding down, but just so you guys can sort of see my thought process when it comes to how I view my deck, this is the list that I took to YCS Niagara, and I'm going to color code these as you will see on the right. So blue will be pile A, red will be pile B, and yellow is pile C. So essentially, you've got a lot of engine cards here, and dangers are a very interesting way to view this. I view most of the dangers as actually engine cards because they help you get to Curious, and while they are also consistency boosters because they're all essentially upstarts, without them the deck kind of can actually struggle with consistency to a degree, but they do also help you get into the Orcust package, which is obviously, more of the pile A sort of deal. And you notice that I actually left a Mothman out as well as the Armageddon Knight, which you might be thinking, well, why aren't those the pile A cards? The reason is that I think that you don't actually need the second Moth rather, or the Armageddon Knight in order to play this deck. Like, they're not mandatory. I think that the 7 dangers are the ones that you kind of need, and then the second Mothman as well as the Armageddon Knight sort of become just more consistency. At that point, the second Mothman is more of a upstart, because I guess you could say the first one is needed for a Jackalope to summon to make rank 4s, things like that. There's like very small niche interactions, and you can classify your deck however you wish. There's no like one correct objective way to do things, but I'm just showing you the way that I view my deck. So you can see that those are going to be the pile B cards, pretty simple and self-explanatory there. And then pile C are cards that not every deck plays, and it's not necessary to run these cards either, even for consistency purposes. These are just cards that serve a variety of different purposes in the deck. So you'll notice that we don't have that many pile C cards, so it is a little bit harder to slot cards in and out. So in those cases, sometimes we have to look to borrow from pile B, which is why I say that, again, they're not mandatory to run in the deck, because there were times I did set out cards like Armageddon Knight, the second Moth, Foolish, cards like that, and even tanky in matchups like Thunder. But you can overall get a pretty solid grasp of how my deck building approach was for this event. So here's going to be some examples of side prep, and this is basically the predetermined siding thing that I keep harping on, but this is actually something that I did actually do prior to YCS Niagara, and why I think that I was very well prepared for the event. So I'll give you 2 different examples. Obviously I'm not going to show you every single one for the sake of time more than anything, but for Sky Striker, for example, I have a table organized like this. So I put the deck name in the top left cell, and then I have headers for in and out, so what I side in versus what I side out. And then I also have specific boxes for going first and for going second. So you can see here that for going first, I'm going to side in Psyframe, Gear Gamma, and the driver, and I'm going to side out White Rabbit, Armageddon Knight, and Cosmic Cyclone. So you might be wondering why I'm like siding out Cosmic Cyclone, for example there. The reason being is that if my combo fully resolves, I want to be able to make sure that I set Eradicator, and the reason I'm siding in Gamma going first is to be able to sort of hedge against a Shotgun Lancia. So obviously you don't have to side exactly like this, but this should give you a pretty good idea as far as where I'm coming from. Like, you want to be able to at least have justified reasoning for why you're siding what you're siding, and then you basically just work from there. Another example here would be the Cyber Orcust matchup, which is one that I expected there to be quite a lot of, and I actually played 3 of them. So you can see that actually for going first and second here, I basically have the exact same game plan, and the reason being is that these cards overall have just fantastic utility going first and second as far as the cards I'm putting in, whereas the cards that I'm siding out, are cards that I feel like I could easily sacrifice based on how I think the deck performs. So generally speaking, I could touch on Armageddon Knight here for a bit. I think it's a very good card going first as far as, just more ways to access your win condition. It's, again, consistency at its core. But overall, you could side it out if you deem that there are cards that are better suited for the matchup. So that's basically the gist of how I go about my siding process, and hopefully you guys can kind of, take away a little bit from just these examples here. And finally, here are some additional notes at the end that, sort of tie into what I was saying earlier, but I just thought I'd mention them. So one thing that you need to know is not only for predetermined siding, but just siding in general, is that you should be able to make your own meta call for the event. So what do I mean by this? What I mean is that you want to basically determine what decks you feel like are going to show up the most, and basically side accordingly. So there might be certain decks that are in the format, so think decks like maybe Pendulum and Thunder this format. Like these decks are definitely in the format, and they're definitely strong decks, and they're powerful decks, but overall my meta call was not those decks. My meta call was, generally speaking, Sky Striker, Orcust, and Salamangre, and those ended up being my most common matchups. I will say I definitely respected Pendulum a bit too much because it was a bad matchup for me, but overall speaking, I think you should stick to your meta call as far as what you're expecting to see at any competitive event, and that'll help you side, consequently more effectively. The next thing is that when you're going first and when you're going second, you're basically going to be having 2 different mindsets. So it depends on what your deck wants to do blind game 1. Like if you're blinding going second anyway, then you can think of this as sort of like the reverse of what most people want to do. But when you're going second, you definitely have to account for the fact that your opponent is going to be able to more than likely achieve their win condition if they go unhindered. So you need to be able to have a way to stop their strategies in the event where you're going second, or even if you want to surprise your opponent by going second yourself and by mind gaming them there, But regardless, you definitely have to have coverage for both going first and going second, even if you want to pivot a single way, or if your deck doesn't care too much, you still need to be able to have cards that are advantageous based on when you are going first or second. The third thing is pretty important, and that is to not overside. So there will be some matchups that maybe you'll lose a couple times in a row and you might think, this is a pretty bad matchup, and then you try and compensate by siding like 9, maybe even 12 cards, and then come to realize that you're just not drawing the cards that you need to win. Like maybe you can stop your opponent for 2 or 3 turns, but you're not seeing any of your own engine cards. So it's pretty important that you are able to side adequately enough that you can sort of stop your opponent when you need to, or help your own strategy, or do any of the aforementioned things that I talked about as far as why we side to begin with. But don't overside, because as the name implies, it's not a main strategy, it's a side strategy. It's one where you're trying to complement your main win condition and hinder your opponents to be able to help facilitate yourself winning. But overall, your deck comes first, your archetype and strategy comes first, not the side deck cards. And then the next point I have here is sometimes if you come across a matchup that maybe is not very anticipated, like you're playing against a rogue deck that you didn't prepare for that much, or maybe you have a very, very favorable matchup where you're thinking, I have a main deck to beat this deck because I expected this in my meta call, like I mentioned earlier. And my deck already has a fantastic matchup, not only because of these cards that I'm putting in, but also just the deck itself is very good against this deck. Then the correct answer could just be to not side at all. Now, of course, you want to like fake side, like you want to like shuffle your cards in and then take them out. Don't ever just, not take out your side deck and then just present your deck to your opponent and say, here you go, because then, they'll get pretty suspicious. But sometimes it is the correct answer to just not side, and keep that in mind, that that is actually a very viable option. And then finally, it's very, very important to find a balance between the specific cards that are blowouts for certain matchups and the generic cards. So what do I mean by this? Cards like Super Poly are very specific cards for certain matchups. One could argue that right now it's actually reasonably generic due to like Salamangreat being in the format as well. But generally speaking, that is a card that is pretty specific for the matchup. Whereas a card like Dino Wrestler Pankratops, you can put in almost any matchup and have it at least do something. But remember what I said earlier, it's all about optimization. You want to be able to make sure that your deck going into games 2 and 3 is the best possible version of itself, given the fact that you are bringing in certain cards and taking out others. So with that in mind, you want to be able to make sure that you have, I guess, high coverage cards that might be lower impact if you are, I guess, expected to go into a somewhat more determined format. Whereas you also need to have some specific cards if you have bad matchups, or if you have matchups that you're going to expect to see quite a lot. If you're going to see them round after round, you have to kind of account for, those matchups being specifically played. So it's pretty important that you have a very good, solid balance between the two. Or even if you favor one side or the other based on the format, just keep in mind that both types of cards exist and you should adjust accordingly. And that's going to be it for this side guide, actually. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I tried to keep it generic as much as I could, and I tried to be as helpful as possible in terms of, allowing you guys to kind of understand why I side deck the way I do, not necessarily just what to take in and what to bring out, etc, etc. But thank you guys again so much for watching this video. Make sure to like the video if you did enjoy watching, and be sure to leave him some comments and feedback in the comment section down below if you guys have anything that you would like to add to this discussion. I would very much like to hear your thoughts. Feel free to hit the subscribe button if you want to see more in-depth analysis style videos like this one. And until next time, I will catch you in the next video. See you guys!